Great. So let me begin by thanking you all for joining us tonight. This is a really terrific turnout for what we think is a very important talk. And it also kicks off our two-day event series on extremism and Islamophobia in perspective, which has been organized by my department, the Religious Studies Department, with the Center for Middle East Studies, and has been very generously supported by our Chancellor, Rebecca Chop, who was actually the initiative for this overall event series. And more than that, we've actually been really fortunate in having over 20 departments and institutes and offices, organizations, and student as co-sponsors. So let me just list them briefly, just as a sign of what a truly university-wide event this is. The AHSS Dean's Office, AHSS Student Advisory Council, the Colorado EU Center for Excellence, the Center for Judaic Studies, the Center for Middle East Studies, the Center for World Languages and Cultures, the Center on Rights Developments, DU Service and Change, the Gender and Women's Studies Program, the DU ILIF Joint Doctoral Program, the DU ILIF Graduate Student Association, Global Health Affairs, Interfaith Advocates, Languages and Literatures Department, the Middle East Discussion Group, the Muslim Law Students Association, the Office of International Education, the Office of Internationalization, the Philosophy Department, the Political Science Department, Religious and Spiritual Life, the Religious Studies Department, the Saudi Students Association, the Social Justice Living and Learning Community, and the Vednanda Center at our law school. So this is a really tremendous listing of organizations that have been supporters. This has also been a great labor of love to organize, and I'd like to thank in particular Alyssa Boltinghouse and Tiffany Wilk, who have overseen all the logistical planning, as well as our colleagues throughout the university who have helped plan and promote these events. And I'd also very much like to thank everyone serving as a speaker, faculty members, visiting scholars, and students today and tomorrow. And chief among those, of course, is tonight's speaker. But I'm not going to introduce her. Religious Studies is actually a highly student-centered department, so what I'm going to do now is get out of the way so that someone more important can come up here and introduce our speaker. So please welcome Sarah Yaffe, who is an undergraduate here, a senior and president of DU Service and Change, who will do the introductions.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Yaffe. As Andrea very nicely introduced myself. First off, thank you. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of all the student organizations co-sponsoring these events on extremism and Islamophobia. So I'd like to begin by telling you a little about our amazing speaker. Oh my goodness, Mia Bloom, a professor of communication at Georgia State University. She conducts ethnographic field research in Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and speaks 8 languages. Wow. Shwiya. She has authored several books and articles on terrorism, violent extremism, including the book Dying to Kill, The Allure of Suicide Terror, Living Together After Ethnic Killing, and Bombshell, Women of Terror. I personally read Dying to Kill in one of my courses last quarter, so it's actually a really surprising honor to get to hear you talk in person. Under the auspices of the Minerva Research Initiative, the Department of Defense, Professor Bloom is currently conducting research with John G. Horgan on how children become involved in terrorist organizations. The results will be published in a book through Cornell University Press entitled Small Arms, Children and Terror. Bloom has a PhD in political science from Columbia University, thank you, a master's in Arab studies from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and a bachelor's from McGill University in Russian, Islamic, and Middle Eastern studies. Tonight, she will be speaking to us on how to understand ISIS' appeal to its recruits. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mia Bloom.
Thank you all for being here. Andrea's already thanked everyone I was going to thank. And when you said, the Saudi Student Association, I especially want to thank the Saudi Student Association because I was on a Saudi scholarship during my tenure at the Center for Arab Studies at Georgetown, but I was never allowed to say thank you because I didn't actually want them knowing that they had funded me. So it was, I just want to say shukran gazilan, and we'll leave it at that. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. I came to Denver University, University of Denver, when was it? Probably in 2000, before everything became very interesting in my life. And I had the pleasure of meeting Tom Fair and seeing your wonderful campus. And so I have a great affection for this particular institution. I know a number of people in political science who I'm also very fond of, Erica Chenoweth and Rachel Epstein. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. And if you haven't taken their classes, let me highly recommend them. All right, so Andrea asked me to do something a little different. For the people in the room who have had either the displeasure or pleasure of reading my books, I'm not sure which, depends on whether they're required or recommended for the class. I generally write about terrorism or suicide terrorism or women in terrorism, and as Ms. Jaffe said, children in terrorism. So something a little bit different was to try to understand ISIS's recruitment. So just to be part of, to launch your fantastic conference on Islamophobia, what I tried to do is integrate some of those themes into the presentation. And what I will do is, Andrea, I'll make this available to you after the talk, so you don't have to worry about taking notes, but you'll have it available to you. I also have a great pleasure now to thank Charlie Winter, who we brought over from London, who helped with this presentation a great deal, so I want to give him credit. So let me start, and when the question period begins, I'm happy to answer anything about this material, but if you have other questions, because there are people in the room who've actually read my books, I'm happy to answer any question you might have. So the Islamic State has been able to attract, and we know this from watching the news, tens of thousands of people. What you may not know, it's 86 countries from around the world. It's both an exposure and absorption into what is a pro-Islamic State echo chamber. And this follows from, sort of the theoretical model created by Mark Sageman, where he talks about the group of guys, where people will be talking about a particular issue, or they'll be talking about their grievances, and then as they talk about it, it escalates. And it's this echo chamber just within small groups. What we're seeing is ISIS creates an echo chamber within social media. So this echo chamber can radicalize and catalyze radicalization, harden extremist ideologies, but the propaganda in the echo chamber alone isn't enough. You need to have an individual who is going to facilitate the recruitment, right? You need an enlister. The presence of this third party provides both logistical information and mitigates perhaps any concerns you may have about travel to Syria. But the third element is essential. The trajectory for all the people that we know who have joined the Islamic State didn't start online. It started offline with either anti-Western expressions, whether they talked about their injustices that are perpetrated against Muslims, or as a response to feelings that they feel of persecution. For example, you're having a conference on Islamophobia. I can tell you that I've had encounters on social media with Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller and those type of people, and it's incredibly unpleasant. My favorite line was, "I don't think Bloom is her real name." But anyways, that was my favorite comment. But yeah, the comments and the rhetoric and the fact that there's a 60 million Islamophobia industry, which I can only imagine is greater now with what's been going on the campaign trail, really does trouble me. And so I think that the conference that you guys have tomorrow and the work that Andrea and all of the 20-odd sponsors is really important and could not be more timely. Some of the lightning rods for these discussions that can lead someone down the path to the ISIS echo chamber has included things like looking what's going on in Syria, the cruelty of Bashar al-Assad, the barrel bombs, or Iraq in the past, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Palestine, and Kashmir. We have Kashmir in the house somewhere. Where's Risha? We got Kashmir in the house. So that we've had all of these issues be lightning rods. And one of the things that's very interesting for me is that the lightning rod isn't necessarily the focus of the organization, but it's a way of getting people involved in the conversation. So social media, and there are a lot of people here who use social media, who are involved heavily, we know that it plays an enormous role. It creates an online social bubble. So what I mean by that is, by and large, now I do this. I do actually follow people who are Republican, or people who don't agree with me, or people who, let's say, don't like the president. But most people, in their following and in their tweets and their retweets, they tend to be very narrowly focused. And if they're retweeting something they disagree with, they're very clear that they disagree with it. But because you generally only follow people that you agree with their view of the world, and you'll tweet or retweet people that you agree with their view of the world, that also creates an additional bubble where you're only getting information filtered through the prism of what you already believe. And so what this does is it reinforces, but it also means that the ability to influence your ideology is extremely limited. Every day the Islamic State circulates between 38 to 60 pieces of propaganda in videos, photos, reports, dawah materials, posters, magazines, and news bulletins. The vast majority of this material is in Arabic. And that's why you probably don't know much about it, because, unlike people in the room, the vast majority of people who study the issue don't speak Arabic. And that has been a major, I don't know, bugaboo for me. And like, I will tell you honestly, it's been at least 20 years since I had to really take an imtihan bil-lugha al-arabiyya, but I know that it is very important to be able to understand the language. And so as a result, for instance, yesterday, was it yesterday or 2 days ago at 1 p.m., a new Dalbik came out. And everybody's talking about it, but they're not necessarily looking at Dar al-Islam in French, or at Istuk in Russian, or at the dozens and dozens of pieces of materials that are coming out in Arabic, except for a very narrow slice. And so one of the projects that Charlie and I are doing right now is we're comparing what is said in English versus what is said in Arabic. And I think it's very important for the students in the room that are, I've talked to a number of you who are looking at this for maybe a master's thesis, to understand from the get-go that when ISIS is producing materials in English, it is for public consumption. They know we're reading it. When they produce materials in Arabic, they think a different group is reading it. And so we get different tone, different language, different emphasis. And so that's one of the projects that Charlie and I are doing right now. I have here, for example, this survey on social media, and we see in terms of the top international regions in terms of social media traffic. Well, so West Asia we have as number 1, Iraq and Syria are 2 and 3. So we know that there is a humongous amount of social media, not just Twitter, Kik, and all the other platforms that in which we, and Telegram especially right now, where we're seeing this kind of recruitment. And I have, for example, Cyber Caliphate, which took over several American departments, Shami Witness, who's very well known, and turned out to be a businessman in Bangladesh. All right, what is the echo chamber? The echo chamber is about establishing rapport. And this is something Erin Saltman, who's at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and a dear friend of mine, said at a conference. She said, you don't go online to buy shoes at Zappos and end up at an ISIS media site. So by and large, people who get to an ISIS media site are looking for something. They are seeking some level of involvement. That there are these intense interactions that are online tend to foster a sense of camaraderie or a sense of community. And this is especially important to people who may feel alienated or outside their communities, or maybe because of Islamophobia, they don't feel part of the main community, whether it's a community in Minneapolis and they feel outside of it because they're Somali, or it's a community where, as a result of some of the rhetoric on the campaign trail, they feel excluded and targeted, they feel uncomfortable. And so what happens is online, they have a very different kind of experience. The supporters engage in an unbelievable amount of, like in the cult literature, they used to call it love bombing. what love bombing means is that the moment somebody who's seeking involvement with ISIS, even just, they want to know more, they start following an ISIS like Shami Witness, or they start following Aqsa Mahmoud, all of a sudden now, everything they tweet, is getting liked by dozens of people. They get 500 new Facebook friends overnight. And so these people who are feeling alone and alienated, all of a sudden now feel popular and empowered. And this is really a lure, because for individuals who are already feeling on the outskirts of society, they're feeling marginalized, this is the actual opposite of feeling marginalized. Now they're feeling like, I've got hundreds of friends on Facebook. Everything I say is retweeted and is liked, and this is really, at the individual level, a very powerful way of bringing someone into the fold. So we see bursts of likes, retweets, new followers, new friends, because we're talking about all the different platforms. It becomes all-consuming and intoxicating as a source of meaning. Online becomes a place where everybody knows your name. You can always find a friend. You can air your grievances, and you feel it's a safe space. And you're getting this emotional support you're not getting in real life. Now, ISIS uses its propaganda to appeal to different kinds of recruits. One of the things that we notice, and I've got a few examples here, Yodo, you only die once, why not make it martyrdom? Sometimes people with the worst pasts create the best futures, and then this is our call of duty. This was targeting a particular sort of slightly less educated, maybe someone who's got a checkered past, that by joining ISIS allows them to completely reinvent themselves. This is the modern sort of jihadi cool. And so what this does is it just targets a particular kind of recruit at the outset, especially before June, July of 2014. It was very important for ISIS to get as many young men as possible. Oh, were you just in jail? No problem. Oh, do you have a history of being in gangs or drug abuse or alcohol abuse? No problem, come to us, we'll fix you. This idea, so this is why you had people going to ISIS having purchased Islam for Dummies or the Quran for Dummies. These were not people who had a firm grasp of the religion, but it's also people who have a sort of propensity towards violence to begin with. And they're appealing to them as, oh, you're sitting at home playing Call of Duty? Why don't you come and have a real Call of Duty? Or this idea that we don't care what you did in the past. Your future now is up to you. You're going to rewrite your history. But then they've now focused, since July of 2014, on different types of people. So we know that they've gone after, for example, professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers. I gave a lecture I was in Lahore at the medical college, and there were a bunch of, and the women were very religious at the medical college in the Department of Psychiatry. They were getting, love bombing from pro-ISIS fanboys and girls. In other words, they had experience firsthand, because they wore the niqab, because they were religious Muslim women, people assumed, oh yes, of course you're going to come and join ISIS. These women were not interested in the least bit. And so one of the things that we started to see, and was validated by a report in the UK, was actually there's an inverse relationship between how religious someone is and whether they have a propensity towards radicalization and joining these groups. Because the people who are most religious, who have the most information about the religion, have the ballast to be able to say, actually, I don't think that's what the Quran says. Or they can say, really? Show me the text. And then, you show them the text in Arabic, and they're like, you're forgetting the second part of the sentence. And so this is where we see a lot of people, this is where they go after converts, they go after people who we call, let's say, reverts, people who have grown up in the West with not a lot of religious exposure, not a lot of religious knowledge, who are Muslims, but very assimilated. And so this is where these women at the medical school were able to say to me, no, we actually knew right from the get-go that these guys are not real Muslims, and we block them. But they have been deliberately seeking professionals. The other thing that we see is that ISIS exploits people's desire to be famous, to make a difference. You know, it's this quest for self-significance, but also it allows them to go from anonymity to instant celebrity. Think about the radiology student, Laith or Aqsa Mahmood, who at 19 disappeared from Glasgow to show up in, you know, as a major recruiter of other women for ISIS. She's gone from, you know, being on the sidelines where, according to people I've spoken to in the UK, she wasn't doing well in school, she was missing a lot of classes, she didn't get into the particular school she wanted to get in because her A levels were not good enough, and so she went from feeling very, you know, down on herself to now she is perhaps one of the most famous women involved in ISIS. And so this is where we see that transition. One of the things where they target women is they really do capitalize on women's desire to do good. You know, the desire especially to help orphans. It's one of the ways they pull women in. And especially so you can think that the conversation is, well, just watch the news. You don't have to look at Al Hayat media channels to be able to look at the horrible things that Bashar al-Assad has done to the Syrian population. We know that Assad has killed more civilians, you know, in the tens of hundreds, more so than ISIS. And so all ISIS has to do is talk about what's actually happening in Syria, and people are heartbroken by the lack of international response, by the lack of our ability to stop it. And as a result, you know, it really does tug at the women's heartstrings. So that's one of the things that they'll be saying where, well, you know, why don't you come to Syria and help the orphans? If you came to Syria, you could do real good. I know you have this desire to help others. If you came to Syria, you could actually put that into practice. Now, what we see is ISIS in its own propaganda in English, in Dabiq, shows how in Raqqa, they are the ones that are caring for the Syrian orphans. They are the ones stepping up to sort of fill the lacuna where the West has failed the Syrian and the Iraqi people. And then again, you'll see here from this other photo, these orphan children were discovered by the photographer days after a drone strike had killed their parents, and they're holding the rubble of what was once their home. I mean, these are very, you know, we've seen, and I've got a picture later on of Aylan Kurdi. We know that these are pictures that really do cause an emotional response. And ISIS knows that it resonates, and that's what they're putting in a lot of their English language propaganda. Here's where they use the picture of Aylan Kurdi, and they say, this is what happens if you leave Raqqa. So what they did was, I mean, in the most venal way possible, they exploited the harrowing images of the 3-year-old who was laying face down in Bodrum and highlighting the human cost of the migrant and immigrant crisis by saying, if you leave ISIS, this is your future. ISIS media machine sought to twist his tragic death to their own advantage, and they featured photos of his body in Dabiq. And so again, it resonates because everybody saw those pictures, they were moved by them, but then ISIS comes in and says, yes, but if they hadn't left, this wouldn't have happened. And look at the way the world has treated Syrian refugees and migrants. This is what you can expect if you leave. They've also been especially interested in recruiting converts. I have 2 examples here of 2 Canadians, André Poulain and John Maguire, both originally from Canada. And so they use these images, both the image of André, he did a Last Will and Testament video, which was aired after he was killed. And you actually saw him killed in real time in the video, where he goes out and he's fighting Bashar al-Assad Syrian army. And these things, again, it's a way of appealing to a whole new constituency. And of course the converts, they don't speak Arabic for the most part, and they require almost a guide through the material, through the Quran, through the Hadith, through the Sunnah. And so if I can't disagree because I don't have the ability to say that's not what the text says, that's why we see, and this is actually a research project that John's doing, a disproportionate number of people joining ISIS are converts. So we've got some of the women, the older women, like Sally Jones or Shanna Maureen Connolly from Denver. You have women who convert to Islam, these women are already seeking because they became converts, but then they go one step further. They're easily manipulated. And so what we've seen is that ISIS has almost a two-pronged approach. They go after extremely young, high-achieving women, and they go after much older convert women. Shannon was only 19, so she's somewhere in the middle, but it's also a different way of approaching them. With the really young girls, for the most part, these would be Muslim girls. I'm thinking of the Bethnal Green Academy girls who disappeared. What happens is, for the most part, there is not a man on the other side of the social media. It's people like Huda Muthani from Alabama who are recruiting American girls, or it's Aqsa Mahmood who's recruiting British girls. And remember how I talked about building this rapport? One of the ways they do that is they have these frames of reference. So for example, is there anyone here in the room from the UK? Okay, so if I was to say to you Jaffa Cakes and PG Tips, you might understand what I was talking about. I'm guessing the vast majority of you have no idea what a Jaffa Cake is. It's one of the reasons why Aqsa, when she's talking to British girls, is able to draw references, whether, you know, it's British celebrities, or it's British pop music, or it's British snacks that they eat. It's gonna be very different here. Here it might be, you know, Twinkies and Kardashians, and in Britain it's gonna be other sort of frames of reference. But that's why these deviant peers, these women who act as intermediaries, bringing the young girls in, that's that crucial link I talked about, those third parties. So we've got the significance of foreign fighters, and the Sufan group has released some maps of what it looks like. This was a little bit hard to read, so after I did this, I found this. Here are foreign fighters by region. The beige is North America. You know, listening to the campaign trail, you would think that this map would look a little different. And you know, the top places like Tunisia and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Jordan, I'm excluding Russia for a second, that's where we have a bit of a difficulty, on the one hand, making the claim that the only reason foreign fighters leave the West is because of Islamophobia. Because at the end of the day, the vast majority of the foreign fighters aren't coming from the West. The vast majority are coming, they're local. And so they have a completely different set of priorities and ways in which they are pulled in. But it's important to understand that when the Western people are interviewed or they talk about their experiences, whether it's on a Tumblr blog or whether it's on Telegram, they do talk about very negative experiences of Islamophobia in the West as having been one of the precursors, you know, one of the foundational reasons that made them angry in the first place. But we also need to be very realistic about what causes someone from Tunisia to leave versus what causes someone from Colorado. So we've seen in a lot of ISIS propaganda, this was Eid Mubarak from the Islamic Caliphate that came out right after Eid al-Adha about 2 years ago. They interviewed, you know, they had mujahideen that were from Trinidad, that were from Britain, from Canada, from every place, from Cambodia, from every place you can imagine. The idea was to convey, come to Raqqa, come to the Islamic State, bring the kids. And we have this, you know, a real utopia here. And so this one's a little hard to read, so I'll read it out to you. Every day there's radio bulletins in 5 languages, photographic reports, high-definition videos. Every month, 2 feature-length documentaries come out. They've got magazines in several languages, so Dabik, maybe we know about, Istok in Russia, Dar al-Islam in French, Constantiniya in Turkish. All of these are Hayat Media Center publications. The dissemination is more sophisticated than any of the rivals, so Jabhat al-Nusra doesn't even come close in their ability to disseminate the propaganda compared to ISIS. The forums have been cast aside, so like the online chat forums that you saw with Al-Qaeda, now instead everything is on social media. And when they're using 25 different social media platforms, and so they easily move from Twitter to Telegram to Instagram to Kik to something else. And so as a result, it becomes extremely difficult to monitor all this if you're monitoring it, but it also allows them, to have very private conversations. So Kik, WhatsApp, SureSpot, Telegram, these are all ones that become much more private. And from what we were listening on the campaign trail again, apparently it is impossible to monitor WhatsApp and Telegram. And so, on the one hand, we love our privacy, but on the other hand, the complaint is that it's precisely these platforms that allow either bad guys to plan operations or to communicate. There's substantial documentation of all facets of life in the so-called Islamic Caliphate, from schools and farms to suicide operations to executions and beheadings. Why do we have so much of it? Well, part of it is a vast branding exercise. I mean, you saw that each of the Al Hayat media productions feature prominently both pre- and post-production logos. They're really big into logos, and this is something we started to see probably about 15 years ago with the Palestinian suicide bombers. And I remember I had come actually here to give a talk in 2000. I was here in 2000, and I was giving a talk on the fact that you would have several different terrorist organizations try to claim responsibility for an attack. And so one of the things the Palestinians group started to do was make a last will and testament video or a martyrdom video, depends on how you call it, in order to make sure that the right group got credit for the attack. And so we started to see, I remember there was one attack, so after I'd given the talks, I got a call, and there was an attack in 2002, and someone said to me, 4 different groups are taking, responsibility because they think this is the way that they're going to be able to project power and influence and importance. And I said, exactly. That's why you almost, with all the groups now, when you have more than one group in a particular arena, you're going to have a last will and testament video, and you have a lot of pre- and post-production branding. So it's product differentiation and marketing. For those of you, because we're in a business school, right? For those of you interested in business, it's all about that. There are 6 narratives that Charlie, from the Arabic versions, there are 6 narratives that we have observed, and Charlie has pulled out: brutality, mercy, war, victimhood, belonging, and utopia. And together, these are the lifeblood of ISIS's recruitment strategy. So what do I mean by brutality? All right, so Ikamat has al-Haraba or Qatl. So basically, this is the meting out of punishments. And so within the Arabic, you'll see either stonings, shootings, beheadings. Also, that last embrace, you get that last embrace before they throw someone off the top of a very tall building. So the idea of meting out punishment. There's also mercy. So they have instances where they put in the propaganda where they have forgiven people. They've brought them back into the fold. And so this idea of mercy, whether it's a series of Libyans who've been brought back into the fold, or just the idea of mercy in general. They also have this notion of war. So you have ghazwa, raids. And so they show in great detail the military movements to show how ISIS is able to project its power and its influence. They also show victimhood, right? So they show the degree to which Assad has been bombing. Or, sometimes they'll mix that it's the bombing of the Crusaders, right? So the Qasif Salabiyin. So this idea that Assad working together with the West, working together with the Shia, working together with Iran, all together is causing all of this devastation. And they will show detailed and graphic photos of the barrel bombs, which I did not want to show you, but here is a few images that we pulled out. This notion of belonging, of brotherhood is very important. So they have, our brothers. There's a series, actually, of the break of the Mujahid. The brothers lying around, having some mint tea, having a little nap by the tree. Like this idea of like this togetherness and this feeling, like the Band of Brothers, if you watch the Tom Hanks series, this Band of Brothers feeling where you will always have someone watching your back. And they have a series of videos and images where, letter to our brothers, and then they'll go and they'll interview each and every one of them from a different country, inevitably. They also have this idea of a utopia. At the height of things, ISIS provided documentary evidence that they were in Nineveh creating these garden nurseries. That we opened up a garden center, and we made it bloom in Nineveh. Or they show the fact that they're handing out zakat, they're giving charity to the poor. They've got ISIS health services, that they are like the men of the Hizbah, which I would have put it in more of the war or the punishment side of things, but they're showing all the different good deeds that ISIS does. And this has been especially correlated since the establishment of the caliphate, when they went after doctors and nurses and all these professionals versus the guys who want to have the real life call of duty. And then separately, we've started to see this notion of preparing the next generation. And this follows from the research that Dr. Horgan and I have done on looking at children. Now, some of these images may be familiar to you, especially the one on the upper right, which turned out to, I think this was just maybe a week ago that it came out. But, I mean, the kids are just so adorable. I know that, it's a kid and a toy gun, and it's really hard to make that distinction between these adorable children and the fact that they're doing horrible things, or they're being trained as cubs, or we will kill you, we're coming after you, or they behead a doll that's dressed up in the orange of Abu Ghraib, to represent Jim Foley or one of the other people that they've killed. It's really quite shocking, and a lot of this, again, is to convey to, let's say, the world, we're not going anywhere. We've got the next generation ready to go, and we can release them at any time. They also show not the training, but also this notion of the children who are, enjoying themselves. They're playing soccer on the soccer pitch. And this is part of the videos that have come out where they're showing a normality in life, that Raqqa is a normal life where normal things happen on a day-to-day basis. More recently, and I apologize for this one, by the way, last night, jihadi was not me. I did not say jihadi. But they talked last night in the Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer about ISIS is recruiting brides online. We know, for example, Birds of Jannah talking about marriage in a sham, Jihad talking about how they can't wait for their husbands to be martyrs. The little boy is actually their son, the one that was in the upper right corner. So, for the love of jihad, Birds of Jannah tweeted, "Till martyrdom do us part," which is the title of Aaron Saltman's and Melanie Smith's report from ISD for, I can't remember if it was Amber, who's interested in women and jihad, but someone in the room is looking to do that research. We've also seen, in the land of jihad, I found my dear Mujahid, like this idea of the perfect man, the perfect wife, the perfect life, which we know to be completely false, because what they do is they treat the women as a commodity. And so they rank the women, and this is going to be horrible to say, the whiter the better, the blonder the better. We know from journalists who have gone undercover and talked to the guys in ISIS, they actually don't like the local Syrian women. They think that the Syrian women are uppity. Abu Omar al-Britani basically has, terrible thing. I guess he's listening. Sorry, Abu Omar. No, but he has terrible things to say about Syrians, and so they actually told him to shut up, and he's no longer allowed to post things anymore. But he was saying, oh, the locals are so awful, and we're going to just ignore these Arabs, and they don't even speak proper Arabic. Like, it's really like, if you read some of the stuff that he's written, he's very negative. But some of the interactions that we've seen, for example, there's a book called In the Skin of a Jihadist by Anna Arel. Came out first in French, and I think it's out in English now. Talked about, she pretended to be a 15-year-old convert. And so because she's a convert, although she was young, she was engaging online conversations with an emir, one of al-Baghdadi's commanders. And he was revealing all sorts of very personal information about the way the Mujahid, about the brothers thinking about women. And again, very utilitarian. And the life that the women have once they get to Raqqa, they're placed in this dorm, this markar, and they're not allowed to leave until they accept someone's hand in marriage. But then when their husband is martyred, because remember, this is all the focus, we sit around and we talk about when our husbands will be martyred and who will be martyred first. The women have to go back into a widow's marker, and they're not even given the 4 months and 10 days that they're supposed to be given for their mourning period. So the women are recycled really quickly, and they're redoled out to like the next group. And part of this is a reflection of the fact that they have more men than women. And one of the things that they've lured men in with this promise of romance is that we will, you'll get a wife, maybe a few Yazidi sex slaves. I mean, they're making promises. Now, I don't know how much that's necessarily appealing to somebody who leaves the Midlands, but it might explain a few of the 1,000 Tunisians where, in 50% of Middle Eastern countries in the Arab world, people postpone marriage until their 30s because marriage is a really costly endeavor. So if you're 19 or 20 years old and you think you're not going to be able to get married for 10 years, in a society in which you don't see premarital sex or dating or petting or the bases or any of that, ISIS being able to offer you this outlet plus a job where there's no jobs, plus a salary, these are ways in which they're pulling people in. That's why I say the appeal to the Western Mujahid is very different in terms of propaganda to the appeal of somebody who's a local, from the Arab world. So one of the things that they convey that, a hijabi loves the fake heroes, but a Muslim loves real lions, they're constantly talking about how, the wives you will get in Raqqa will be perfect. They'll be ideal. They'll be wonderful. And true love doesn't end at death. If Allah wills it, it'll continue in Jannah. Together for Jannah means paradise for those of you who don't speak Arabic. And so you see all of these, very playful selfies where the women are conveying that they love their husbands and they love when they become martyred because now they'll be, they'll be famous widows of martyrs. What they don't realize is, no, you're going back into the widow's markar and you're going to be distributed a second time. And probably you won't get as good a husband because now it's your second time around and you no longer can claim purity. How do we dismantle the brand? How do we fight this? And so we've had a few, conversations with either the State Department, they've renamed the CMCC. So they're doing counter messaging, but they've renamed that department. ISIS itself has expended a great deal of energy in building this brand that I've presented to you tonight. Its propaganda, the people who are disseminating the propaganda hold a monopoly on how they disseminate the information. So for example, what I told you about Abu Umar al-Britani, he's been shut down. He's been told, no, you need to shut up now, and right away he stops producing materials. It's also, unfortunately, with our media, ISIS propaganda is like the first place where the media gets their information about ISIS. And so we're reproducing ISIS propaganda in almost an unchallenged way. And we take some of what they say on Twitter, as real or true, knowing full well that the stuff that's said in English is specifically for our, consumption. So this is where we want to try to show the differences between the languages. We need to challenge ISIS's version of events. How can it be contested? And a good way to start is direct counter messaging. There are people in the State Department that are engaged in this in, I think, 5 or 6 different languages, but also dissidents, refugees, people who've managed to escape. We need to give them a louder voice. And so my reaction, and this is actually a very funny story. It's a true story. I was at the White House last year. I was invited by the president for the Countering Violent Extremism conference. And they broke us up into, I guess, different groups. And so, like, the women was one group and the children was one group. And it was very disheartening because of course, the room was overwhelmingly female. Because when you're talking about women and terrorism, you usually only get women interested in women and terrorism. But so we broke into different groups, and I didn't know anybody in the room. I'm the opposite of a Washington insider. And someone said, is there anything hopeful? And I said, well, actually, what we saw in Colorado gives me great hope. And then I started to explain. I said, the state's attorney in Colorado made a decision that when 3 very young girls disappeared and they were able to intercept them in Frankfurt, they brought them home. There were no charges filed. Until this day, we don't know their names. That says to me that the state of Colorado, while prosecuting Shannon Maureen Connolly, who had actively engaged and plotted, and she, trained with the U.S. Army Reserves in order to learn tactics, and she was, I guess, reconnoitering synagogues, maybe to do something there. That was, clearly someone who wanted to be involved in a different way. But these really young girls, the 2 sisters and their friend, who were able to be brought back, convey to the community here in Colorado and to Denver and in Colorado in general that if your kid goes missing, you can call the police, you can call the FBI, we'll bring them back, and you won't lose them. Because a lot of parents are very hesitant to call the police or the FBI or the authorities, whether it's MI5 in the UK, because they're worried, what are the ramifications going to be? Am I going to lose my kid? Is my kid going to jail? We saw what happened in Chicago. That is a great concern. Kids just going to Syria, because kids make mistakes. And, I'm sure everyone in the room when they were 15 did things that now, as they're older, they wish they hadn't done, but at least you didn't go to jail for it. So, unbeknownst to me, your state's attorney was in the back of the room. There was only like 4 guys, but I didn't know him. And he just said, I texted my office to say that the only hopeful thing that I could mention was in Colorado. So again, very happy to be in Colorado. You guys are ahead of the curve. So the returnees who return, disillusioned and brutalized, need to be integrated into the counter-narratives. We need to understand refugees are not a source of a potential 5th column that are going to do bad things in this country, but the refugees are a great source of information to say how bad ISIS is, and to be able to perhaps prevent individuals who are thinking, who are on the fence about going, no, let me tell you about what it's really like. The returnees must be considered as resources to integrate into a solution and not a group to be cast aside. And this is where, I was very disheartened that CNN, who has been very, very good to me, sorry, Dan is the only one in the room that's going to get that joke because we're the same age. So CNN, when Bataclan happened and they focused on one of the potential attackers having been a refugee versus 7 who were not, I just thought to myself, they were whipping up this mass hysteria about refugees. And that was CNN. I wasn't watching Fox. And so the problem is we've now entered into sort of a rhetoric that the refugees are potential 5th columnists, that they're going to be doing something awful, that they're a danger, we cannot let them in. That then extended to lots of other people we can't let in. And the fact is, if we want to prevent other people from going, having individuals who have the experience, they are a great resource. And I can tell you that so for those who, I'm going to say the Cold War, this was a long time ago, so from 1945 until 1991, we were pretty much in not a hot war, but a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Russian dissidents provided both the State Department and the CIA and the FBI huge amounts of information. And Russian dissidents helped us understand what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, because there was no free media, there was no social media, there was no Twitter. And so as a result, we understood that people who leave countries are a great inside window into what's going on. We didn't have the kinds of conversations we're having now. So I want to end there with thinking about what we can do better. So you guys are about to face primaries and then elections. And what I would say is that a lot of the rhetoric is far more dangerous than the refugees have ever been. And I'm going to leave it there because we are talking about Islamophobia. And thank you so much for your time and for you listening to me today. You know, this notion of countering violent extremism, which was something that we talked about last year at the White House. You know, people have talked about women's role. And I think part of it is that there's a little bit of an assumption, and it's validated by the UN Security Council's 1325, this idea of gender mainstreaming, the idea that, you know, women are the peacemakers, that if we have more women, we're automatically going to have better results. I think it's a little bit misleading. I think in the same way that women can be a fantastic resource, they could also be the source of radicalization. We've seen in lots of different communities, in the extreme right wing, we've seen it in, I remember there was this book Alison Jameson wrote called Shoot the Women First. And in fact, the German police and the Italian police were under instructions that when they were fighting terrorism in the 60s and 70s and the almost 80s, that if they got to a terrorist cell, shoot the women first, because the women were going to be more extreme than the men. We saw, for example, with Mrs. Tsarnaev as potentially being a source of some of the radical viewpoints that her sons then inherited. We also know that women can be a mitigating factor. They can have a wonderfully, you know, peaceful effect. So a good friend of mine is the highest ranking Salafi police officer in the UK. And Abdul Hai says that, you know, when they have a hostage situation, if it's a Muslim, the first thing they do is they get the mother on the phone, because the mother can talk the person down. We know, for example, with a lot of the suicide bombers, they separate them from their mothers for a period of 1 to 2 months for fear that the mother will convince the person to change their mind and not carry out the mission. So we have two parallel templates, one in which women are a fantastic solution and one in which women are part of the problem. What we don't have is the ability to differentiate. So at some point, right before I was at the White House, George Pirro asked me to come down to do their training session for the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Florida. And George was and still is one of the highest ranking Arabic-speaking people at the FBI. One of the few people who, you know, along with Ali Soufan, who spoke Arabic. You know, when 9/11 happened, not a lot of Arabs in the FBI. Still, not a lot of Arabs or Arabic speakers in the FBI. Something that they really need to fix. But one of the things that, you know, they were asking me, because these are cops, these are police officers, and they're like, okay, so if we have a suspect, who should we talk to? Who should we try to create as a CI, a confidential informant? And I thought about it for a second, and I would say, the mothers, not the wives. Because what we've seen, and this is a really interesting contrast. And again, I apologize for those of you who are like, 1974. In 1974, when Black September, that is the terrorist group perpetrated Munich, some of you may have seen the movie, perpetrated the Munich massacre at the Olympics. When they disbanded Black September, one of the ways that they did it successfully was they married the guys off. Because if you have a wife and you have a kid and you have a mortgage, you got no time for terror. Al-Qaeda changes this dynamic. And what we saw with Al-Qaeda is that they married the men off to women who were just as smooth, as steadfast as the men. And what that did is it prevented the men from ever leaving the group. And so we started with this idea that no, marry them off. and that'll take them out of terrorism. And we ended up starting to see this, I guess, in the late 90s, where Al-Qaeda, and especially groups like Jamiat Islamiyah in Indonesia, would use marriage to fortify the participation. It's one of the things I wrote about in Bombshell, where I talked about the fact that it was almost like these royal marriages of the 12th and 13th century in Europe, where in Indonesia, JI would marry the leader of one, mantika, of one part of Jamiat Islamiyah, let's say in Poso, to the sister of a leader in Solo or in Yogyakarta, and the idea was to keep this cohesive family link. So it wasn't just that they were working together with the same ideology and that they were members of Jamiat Islamiyah or JI, but that they were also related. So the idea was that, oh, you're not going to disappoint my brother. You're not going to embarrass me with my family. And so this is where we have this real tension. So countering violent extremism, I think, speaks differently to women in ways that have to do, I'll give you an example, this idea of the veil. So FGM, no, absolutely not, never. But the veil is complicated because there are a lot of women who choose to wear the veil and they don't see it as a source of oppression. And I remember when I was at Casa in Cairo, where there were very modern women whose mothers and grandmothers didn't wear the veil, and they had chosen to put on the veil because for them it was a way of empowering themselves, of being taken seriously, not being judged by how they looked, and that people would have to listen to what they said and not not based on their appearance. And yet we assume that any woman in a veil is automatically oppressed and is radicalized, and that's where there's a problem. So I think part of it has to be nuance, and we as Americans are not great with nuance, and so because the women's CVE is far more nuanced, that's where I think it's been still a major hurdle. So that was an extremely long answer to your question, and I apologize, Megan, and I apologize for confusing you with Amber. In the back. So one of the things that we've seen with the fanboys and the support networks and the people who tweet and retweet, so they're not actively involved in ISIS, but they're this sort of supportive environment, is that when an account shuts down, they just open up a new account. And in fact, some of the ISIS members take great pride in going, 5th time I've been shut down, 10th time I've been shut down. It becomes a badge of honor. Now, J.M. Berger, who wrote the book on ISIS with Jessica Stern, talks about the fact that every time that they shut down and they have to start up again, the number of followers might be smaller, so that it's whittling it away. The problem is it's moving from Twitter to Telegram or to Kick or to Ask FM or to one of the other platforms. So it's impossible to be able to monitor all of the 25 platforms simultaneously, but also there's no guarantee that when you shut them down, they don't just start up a new account. And there are bots now. Don't even ask me why I even know this, because I work with someone at Arizona State University who's in computer science, so I actually understand the bots now. So there are bots now that will keep all the followers who you follow and the people who follow you. When you create a new account, you can just instantly export them over. And so this is where it doesn't have the same efficacy that we think it will. There's also issues of, what's like certain things we know from Facebook and Twitter and other platforms that, pictures of beheadings or videos of beheadings, you're not going to be able to tweet or retweet. But for the most part, the other content starts, delving into issues of free speech. So on the one hand, you look at some of what Edward Snowden brought to light as far as the degree to which the government is observing and monitoring and listening, and people are outraged by it. So there are these shades of gray. I know that the CMCC, or the State Department now, wants to make claims that it's working. We don't actually know it's working. And I'll give you an example. When we found out that Shami Witness was a businessman in Bangladesh, wasn't who he said he was, we see that as, okay, we've exposed them, and so we think that's a win. But what they don't realize is that nobody in ISIS is bothered by the fact that he's in Bangladesh and he's a businessman. So what we consider to be a win or a loss doesn't resonate the same way. And we have to take into account that they don't see things the way we see things. So then, so how do we even have metrics of what's working? Because we think, oh yeah, we totally exposed Shami Witness as a fraud, and yet Shami Witness is no less, in fact, they're like, oh, he's a social media martyr. So he's no less popular, even though we've exposed him as a fraud. So this is where you have this tension. So it's a great idea, but it's really hard to execute. And then even as an idea starts getting complicated when we start thinking about freedom of speech and privacy, so on. In the back.
There are calls for moderate Muslims to provide a counter-narrative. One, is that fair to ask them to be responsible for countering ISIS's message? And then two, would a Muslim counter-narrative work?
Well, it's a great question, absolutely. So I'm of the personal view. Oh, and I apologize, I forgot to do my whole spiel about nothing I say is a representative, because we mentioned Minerva. Nothing I say, I make all my own mistakes, and nothing I say represents the US government and any of that. So I forgot about my disclaimer. I was so excited about so many people in the room. I personally, from the way you asked your question, I think I agree with you. I think it's outrageous that we expect every time something bad happens and it's a Muslim, that we expect Muslims to apologize for it. And I think that even asking a Muslim community, for instance, we didn't ask, blonde-haired guys with a bad haircut to apologize for Dylan Roof. Like, we don't have the same standards. But I do think that a Muslim counter-narrative, when I say do I think they should do it, I think that they can do it in a way that's more effective, because they'll understand the frames of reference and be able to use language and use sort of this empathy that we can't possibly be able to do. I'll give you an example. Chris Canlin's research did this wonderful project a few years ago. So you may not realize there was a big push from University of Oklahoma in the 1980s when the Russians were fighting in Afghanistan, and the United States put out a series of textbooks. And it was the University of Oklahoma, do you remember all this? Had helped create these textbooks that were about fighting off occupation, because it was intended for the Afghan people in Pashto, and it was distributed widely, and it was funded by the US government. Yet what they didn't realize is they used the same textbooks when it was the Americans. So the problem is we have great intentions, but sometimes we miss the boat. So if it's being done by people from the community, it might resonate better. But what we've seen is, in fact, ISIS just looks at people like that and calls them murtads, apostates. Like, they don't, but what they can do is they can talk to people who are maybe sitting on the fence, maybe people who are observers, maybe people who are starting to feel alienated, but then at least they have that community to talk to. I don't think that group of moderate Muslim Americans are going to be able to convince ISIS that they're wrong. I know that, so my friend Mubin Sheikh spends hours every day fighting these guys, hit after hit, citation after citation from the Quran, from the Hadith, making references to, a tayyibah, like Surat al-Tayyibah, like, it doesn't matter. These guys are not going to be convinced. But what might be convinced is that somebody who's watching all this goes, well, wait a second, so it's not black and white. They don't have all the answers. So I still think, the work that Mubin is doing, the work that Humaira Khan is doing, that these are really important organizations. A lot of them are in DC, that, they're working, there's a number of Muslim groups in Los Angeles, a lot of the community outreach. I mean, the problem is the way in which it's executed. When we look at Prevent and Channel in the UK, and we see, I don't know if you saw this story, Risha saw it because I know she liked it, but so 2 days ago, a kid who in his class said, I live in a terrorist house, was because he was trying to say terrorist. Like they have a terrorist. But he misspelled it, and he said terrorist. And so because of prevent, the teacher had to call the police, and the police had to interview this 10-year-old kid, and it was basically a spelling error. So it's not the fact that these programs exist, it's the way they're executed that we have to be really careful about. And so there are, you know, great people in this country, in California, in Minneapolis, in Boston, that are doing, you know, there's a fantastic program in Maryland run by lovely woman, Hedia, who does community outreach. And they work with the police, or they work with the community, they bridge it in a way to avoid misunderstandings, like apparently my friends who watch the Fox News call him Clockmed. Like, you know, this idea of a kid who builds a clock and is mistaken for a bomb, that, you know, if there's more community dialogue and people are, you know, or that there's calligraphy from the Quran and they close the school district for a week, that there's a lot of misunderstanding. So, you know, what I would say is exposure to the culture, exposure to the language, more communication rather than everyone going off into their corners is the best solution. But I do think that these Muslim groups have a fantastic role to play. But like you, I don't think they should have to apologize. Oh, Dan.
You mentioned several times that the Assad regime's brutality.
So, I mean, Dan makes a really good point. The three women, we actually, Charlie and I, put that in the piece that we wrote for the Daily Beast. It was actually the fact that they couldn't have their proper mourning period, in addition to the fact that their husbands had been killed, not fighting Bashar al-Assad or fighting the Americans or fighting, you know, YPG, but fighting other Muslims. That combination, it was sort of the first chink in the chain and the chink in the armor, and then sort of the nail in the coffin was within, you know, the 2 weeks of the husband being killed, you know, someone from his unit knocking on the door saying, well, you know, I know you're available now. And so that combination was really tough on them. I think, you know, Dan makes a really good point. John wrote a book called Walking Away from Terrorism. And in it, he interviewed people who had been members of terrorist groups, everything from, you know, the Provisional IRA, Al-Qaeda, PLO, all groups in between, you know, Red Brigade, FARC, so on. And these were all people who had walked away from terrorism. And the thing that was most common in all of the interviews and these narratives of, as you can imagine, very different kinds of people who had joined terrorist movements. Some were religious, some were jihadi, some were secular, leftist, nationalists, and so on, was disillusionment. It was when they realized that involvement in terrorism was very different from the fantasy of what they thought it would be like. And it was that disconnect. Now, one of the things that was very interesting with the extreme right wing is when people started to have their first moment of doubt, and they were really afraid that they would be discovered, instead of leaving right away, they actually got more tattoos. They actually were more violent. They beat up more African Americans. They were more assertive because they were really afraid that by having the personal doubts, somebody would figure it out and they would be exposed. And so the behavior doesn't match what's going on inside their head and their heart. So the exploiting the disconnect, the disillusionment, is one of the things that he came out with to say, listen, this is how we do it. How do we exploit disillusionment? Well, you know, this is where you have people who are formers that are very persuasive. You know, a friend of ours, Christian Piccolini, had been involved in the neo-Nazi movement, you know, from the age of 16 for decades. He goes around the country talking to young white guys about his experiences. These are people who are on the edge. You know, they're looking at the extreme right wing or the Tea Party or Sovereign Citizen or the militias, and they're, you know, dabbling a little bit. They're going to the rock concerts. And he's like, no, let me tell you about my experiences. And it's precisely the disillusionment that he can talk to these people and he can relate to them. And they look at him and, you know, he looks like them. And we can't underestimate the value and the ability of someone to be able to relate to the individual who's talking about their, incredible disillusionment. And it's the disillusionment that might be that first, chink in the armor. It may not prevent them, but that's what they just need, is that first little bit, that seed of doubt that's planted. John interviewed one of the sheikhs who had trained the Bali bombers. And, you asked him, well, you were kind of responsible, so what made you decide to leave? And now he runs a countering violent extremism organization in Indonesia. And I said, well, look, what made you leave? Because you were actually the person pushing people towards the ideology, towards involvement in violence. And he said, well, I was arrested, and they put me in a cell. And I thought, oh, the torture is coming. And they gave me a prayer mat and a Quran. And then they gave me a cup of coffee. And when the torture never happened, I started to wonder, what else did they lie to me about? And so it's one of the reasons why, I'm extremely opposed to the use of torture, because I have this one example. The absence of torture was the first step in his journey to not being someone who radicalizes and instead someone who de-radicalizes. So, part of what I say looks at sort of the history of terrorism from these experiences, and it crosses a lot of these groups. And it's sort of, maybe it's either the benefit or the very strange reality of having been doing this for 26 years now. I don't only see terrorism through the lens of Al-Qaeda and the jihad. We have a lot of other terrorist groups, and we can learn so much from those other terrorist groups to inform and prevent and even, create the counter narratives that might work in the current world that we live in. But part of the problem is, we have the tunnel vision where we only see the one. But I think, Dan, you're 100% right. It's about the disillusionment. It's about just questioning for one moment that maybe the truth, that black and white truth that you've been told, isn't 100% accurate. It's a great example you give, because one of the first chinks in the armor for Provisional IRA and also for the UVF was the way they were spending their money. So the Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland used to pretend that it was keeping the community safe from drug dealers. And then all of a sudden, John Horgan and Max Taylor wrote an article called Playing the Green Card, which showed in terms of evidence that they were getting rid of some drug dealers, but they were also getting a piece of the action from other drug dealers. So those drug dealers they protected, and they got rid of the drug dealers that weren't giving them a percentage. And that really upset the community. They were like, well, wait a second. We were under the impression that this group was protecting us from the drug dealers, when in fact they're in cahoots. The same thing happened with Veronica Guerin, the journalist, who uncovered what the UVF, the Ulster forces were doing. This is the Protestant terrorists in Northern Ireland. And she eventually got killed for it. But when it became clear through auditing where the money was going, that's when they realized people were lining their pockets. What we've seen with ISIS is this ability to justify. So you guys may have heard that last week a document was leaked. ISIS has been cutting the salaries 50% of the people in the caliphate. And from their perspective, they're like, well, it says in the Quran that you need to give zakat and you need to give a portion of your money to the state in order to, help the poor and help the needy. And so they'll find a justification for it. But what we need is the auditing ISIS. I was like auditing a class. We need the auditing ISIS to show that, Baghdadi is buying Rolex watches and, he's making his house look like Downton Abbey, or, these are the things that people might, raise an eyebrow. But the problem is most people who are subscribers to this propaganda don't believe anything that comes out of Western media. So it is interesting that, it doesn't matter what we say, because they've already trained all of their followers to ignore anything that doesn't come out of Al Hayat Media Center or doesn't come out from Al Nawat, their own newspapers. So we could blow the lid off of it, but whether they would believe it or not would be another issue. So it's a great idea, but I don't know how we would do it. So the Washington Post produced a report last year where they said that there's a difference between the Ansar, the locals, and the Mujahideen that are coming from outside. The guys coming from outside, the foreign fighters, are making a lot more money. They get better cars, better women. That there is a disconnect. That the local Syrians are really upset about it. But we also know that anyone that tries to leave ISIS, they kill. So there have been periods of time where they've killed hundreds of individuals for wanting to leave. And so, you've got people who are between a rock and a hard place. They may really resent the fact that these foreigners come in, and then you have Abu Omar al-Britani, who says really horrible things about the locals. The locals resent the heck out of the foreigners who are in their country, like you said, spending, acting like thugs, throwing money around, being, and they're in their country, but there isn't anything they can do about it. Because if they're under ISIS control, if they voice anything, they get killed. If, it's like Hirschman, right? So if you voice or if you exit, those are the two situations you'll get killed. So all you can do is sort of keep your head down and hope that they'll go away. It's very disempowering for Syrians who don't want ISIS there. And so they have kind of no choice. We know from the 3 women that were profiled in the paper that they joined Al-Khansa, the all-female brigade, because they needed food. And they thought that it would protect their families and that it would give them a certain, wasta, like a certain leverage. And in the end, none of that worked. Sir. So there's 2 parts to the question. I mean, they have had serious, significant territorial losses like Kobane, right? And so the fact that they lose territory doesn't seem to resonate in our media, so it certainly doesn't resonate in theirs. But we have seen a shift, for example, towards Libya, whether it's that they want to go after Libyan oil, or they've started to distribute Al-Naba in Libya as well, which is the local paper, which is in Arabic, and about sort of buoying up everyone's morale and making everyone feel good about ISIS, and not about because a lot of Dabiq is theology and theological debates. It's not a scintillating magazine, I have to tell you. I was reading it on the plane. By the way, don't read Dabiq on the plane. Don't read my book on the plane. Not a good thing to read on planes. But I wanted to, make sure I had read it before I got here. I think that if they lose territorial control, it goes back to the young lady's question, that the locals will be able to, shunt off the control and maybe prevent them from recapturing it. But the problem is that it's a moving target. There is a bit of this whack-a-mole, right? So they lose Kobani, they lose Sinjar, they lose significant territory. So we are seeing, if you look at the military aspect of it, ISIS is shrinking, but the ideology is growing. So the problem is, while territorially they are contracting, they are able to recruit more and more people abroad. And then so that will be a new, fresh set of recruits. Now, whether these people are going to actually be able to be effective combat soldiers is another issue. But one of the things that I've noticed is that when the president says we're winning, or when the president says that, ISIS is on the run, it becomes so politicized that everyone who is opposed to the president basically disagrees. So even though we know that ISIS is contracting territorially, you'd be hard-pressed to find it in our media. I'm told I have only one last question. So is there anyone who's... Sir? And that's the we-them dynamic, the duality of it, is that, a lot of my Muslim American friends or Muslim Canadian friends are as Western as anyone in the room. And so part of it is this idea of this bifurcation that, Muslims are these exotic creatures that are entirely unknowable and we'll never quite be able to fathom them. And I'm just thinking that, that's kind of fits within the rhetoric of, on the one hand, Donald Trump, and on the other hand, ISIS. I actually saw an image today in the Dabiq that really bothered me. It was they had pictures of these Shia mullahs and like the bullets, and I was like, oh wait, didn't the Republicans do that for some female Democratic, I guess they were senators or congresswomen, where they had their pictures, and I was like, oh my God, like I don't know who's copying whom. So part of it is, I think that, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that, we really focus on the violence and how glossy the photos are and how professional the media is. We focus on those elements of it. What we don't focus on is the degree to which they are manipulating. They're taking images that we produce and using it for their own benefit. And there is a real need to have conversations that allow us to demystify, as you said, the we and the them, so that we are all we, and we are probably also them. But we can all be we. We.